Hey there, cuties. So we out in this bit doing a little enlisting. Um, got this new event going on, Lead Storm. Pretty cool. Um, so we're just gonna be playing that for the next 2 weeks, I guess. I'm glad to finally be playing enlisted again. They haven't had an event for like a month, so I've been taking some time off. Um, yeah, in fact, like, yeah, it's like exactly a month almost because I was looking back at the Nate Hagen podcast, which I love to listen to while we're playing this, and yeah, I'm a month behind now. I'm lacking in my knowledge, but yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and hit play on this John, and then we'll dive in. So this is the TGS 165 where we're picking out that. I think I was in the middle of a different one before, but I don't know. I can't remember where it was, so then this one looked cool. So I'm gonna check it out. Anyway, let's cue and go ham.
Joining me today is neuroscientist and philosopher Dr. Ian McGilchrist for his second appearance on The Great Simplification. Every generation, in my opinion, we have a few philosophers that cut to the core of the cultural conversation of humanity at that time. I believe Ian is one of such philosophers and have been greatly impacted by his work. Ian is the Quondam Fellow of All Souls College in Oxford, has been a research fellow in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins Hospital, as well as many other academic positions in the field of psychiatry and neuroscience. He is the author of a number of books, but is best known for The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, as well as his book on neuroscience, epistemology, and ontology called The Matter with Things, Our Brains, Our Delusions, and the Unmaking of Our World. And I'm still making it through the 1,800 pages of that book.
Oh man, somebody's already way ahead.
Ian,
what?
We covered an overview of his work on the differences between the left and right hemisphere of the human brain, with the left taking on a more analytical, narrow, problem-solving role, and the right hemisphere being responsible for seeing the holistic, contextual, and relational view of the world. We also talked about how that theory connects with things like wisdom, psychedelics, and artificial intelligence. If you haven't given that a watch or listen, I highly recommend that you watch that first before the second conversation. It will be linked in the description of the episode. Today's episode is a more personal follow-up conversation on how Ian's research can influence how we live our everyday lives in search of a more balanced and wonder-filled life ahead of the Great Simplification.
Yeah, that motherfucker is flying.
Having ripple effects of how we connect with our communities, societies, and the natural world. This was a winding discussion of around 2 hours, covering a myriad of topics from how we use our attention to the importance of Zen. But the central themes of this episode are at the core of this platform, The Great Simplification. How can we expect a wiser and more holistic future, materially less?
These guys are much better
if we're not implementing those
the people I was playing with last night
in our lives as individuals.
Oh.
With that, please welcome my friend Ian Gilchrist. Sir Ian, welcome back. Great to see you.
I didn't know I'd been honored in this way, but thank you anyway. It's great to be back with you, Nate.
Well, as an American, there's all kinds of British citizens that we hear the word sir, and it doesn't really mean much. But in the time since I talked to you first 18 months ago and now, I've read a lot more of your materials, though I haven't read them all because it's like 2,500 pages. And I've listened to your talks, and I've really kind of recognized that your thinking is foundational to what our species faces. And so when I call you Sir Ian, I mean it as an honorific.
Very nice.
So how are you?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. Although it's hard to separate oneself from the condition of the world, isn't it, at the moment? But there we go.
Yeah. When people ask me how I'm doing, I usually say good or quite well, asterisk.
Yeah, quite.
There's an asterisk these days.
There usually is.
So it was 18 months ago you were on the show, and you posted a wonderful introduction to your thinking, but we unpack quite a bit the right and the left hemisphere and why
Sure.
The right hemisphere is generally the center for holistic, contextual, intuitive thinking, while the left hemisphere is dominated by analysis, categorization, and kind of narrow-minded problem solving. And of course, we needed both in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. But now the roles have switched, and the master, which should be the right hemisphere, has become the emissary to the master in our current culture, which is the left brain kind of problem-solving categorization. So today I wanted to just assume that people know that general context and take a deeper dive into the situation that humans and our 10 million other species in the biosphere face. So let me just dive right into it. As a renowned psychiatrist and a brain scientist who spent pretty much your whole career studying the brains and behaviors of Homo sapiens, a species you and I are both card-carrying members of.
Hey, what the hell?
You see modern civilization, not so metaphorically, on your couch. What is your diagnosis?
There's several ways of thinking about that, I suppose. I would think that this patient who come to me was anxious, very anxious, unsatisfied, depressed, in fact, overstimulated, over-involved with his or her own inner life and not enough with a more general vision of life. I would think that was a sort of problem, not necessarily an innate problem of narcissism, but that was part of the picture. And at another level, I would say that they were, as I believe we all are now, and this helps to explain why we're so unhappy, we're taking on board a vision of ourselves and of the world, which is so far amiss and so far short of the reality of who we are, that it is not surprising that we feel unfulfilled, frustrated, depressed, rudderless, and as though there is no point in things. So I would see this anxious, depressed patient, I would see that person as over-dependent on the left hemisphere's thinking, and I would see them as, in a simple sense, somewhat narcissistic.
And when you give that diagnosis, is that like taking 8 billion personality tests and getting the average?
No.
Or is that diagnosis you just described to a culture as a whole?
Oh, very much the second of those. I mean, I think it's very important, again, as in everything, to see a patient, and in this case, a whole society, holistically, rather than simply scoring them, going back once again to trying to measure things. And I mean, occasionally that can be very helpful, and I'm not against it at all. It tends to be what psychologists rather than psychiatrists do. And it has a place. But I think that when you're dealing with somebody that's sick, you need to have a holistic human understanding of what it is that's going on for them and why they feel the way they feel.
So in our first interview, you said that as a psychiatrist, and you've been a practicing psychiatrist most of your adult life, you usually know very early on what the patient needs to do. But the important learning is that they eventually at some point had to understand what they had to do. So you telling them solution didn't matter until it was paired with their own recognition.
Exactly.
How does this individual therapy map on to the civilizational diagnosis you just gave?
Damn.
Well, gosh, I think it's a really crucial point, and I think it's important to emphasize what you've said, which is that people don't hear it when you tell them when you first meet them, but what you need to do is more of this or less of that. And and that's because they're not in a place to think like that, to see the problem in the form that you are seeing it. So it's not just that it's somehow wrong, but I'll buy it and go with it. It's like it's useless. So the analogy here is that people want me very often, and it's a very understandable reaction. I paint a picture of the modern world in so many respects as a reflection of the triumph of left hemisphere thinking over far more subtle right hemisphere thinking. Black and white, cut and dried, either or, categorical, abstracted, theoretical, but not actually in that place where that is lived experience. And they want me to give them some answers, and that's very understandable, because with left hemisphere thinking, one of the problems is that you see everything as a series of problems that must have solutions. But I think that instead of thinking in this problem-solution way, which has not worked, I'm not saying I don't think it's the best way to approach things, this individual problem, individual solution way. I'm saying it is not working, it has not worked, it never will work, because it purports, what it deals with, as the left hemisphere always does deal with, is an immediate, isolated question or problem. It's the one that helps us get stuff in a situation quickly. But what we are always dealing with human society,
how did I get those guys?
A fortiori, looking at the complexity of the natural world and even more of the whole of the earth, we are looking at a complex system in which there isn't a simple cause and effect chain going on. There are many causes for every effect, and they interact with one another. And you won't get anywhere by simply applying a simple solution. And that's what people are longing for. If only I knew I could do this and everything would be all right. But I could waste your time and mine by saying, do this. But it won't make everything all right, because we need to think at a bigger, broader, deeper level. We need to think in terms of complexity, and I'm using that term in a technical sense that most people nowadays have heard about. Complex systems are not just complicated systems, like there's quite a lot to them. It's that they act in a different way from a complicated mechanism like a jumbo jet aircraft engine. So they require a different kind of approach, a systemic approach in which one's looking more wisely for a shift of perspective. And I think that what people need is exactly what they get when they enter into therapy. They get an aha moment. And my problem as a very naive young psychiatrist was being able to see the solution in outline, but not allowing them to get the aha moment in which they see something different. And it may actually be the same set of circumstances, just seen from a quite different point of view. It's like that illustration of the duck rabbit. You keep looking at it and thinking it's a duck, but hey, it's actually a rabbit, or whatever it might be. So it's that kind of change. And in thinking about this, if I may, Nate, and I'm rather tentative in bringing such a thing into the discussion here.
Damn, he's already so far
because
ahead.
it might sound inappropriate or grand or something, but the distinction, it occurred to me, is very much like the one described where in the Gospel of St. Matthew, where the Pharisees come to Jesus. And the Pharisees were very concerned with rules and procedures and the legalistic detail. And they said to him, which of the laws is the most important law? So it's almost like saying, so which is the one that I really must obey? And Jesus said, and I can't remember the exact words, but I think it was, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy mind. And the second commandment is like that. It is love thy neighbor as thyself. On this, he said, on this hangs all the law and the prophets. In other words, our tendency is to get things back to front, to think the rules, the procedures, the things we do are the important things. But it is the disposition that matters. And from that comes, on that hangs all the law and the prophets. Now, what I've struggled to get across, and I keep on trying to find a better way of putting this, because people think, oh, well, that's all very well, but I want something concrete to do now. What I'm trying to say is that simply doesn't work. And lots of the problems we have now are actually due to previous attempts to solve a different problem. And they've left us worse off than we were. So what we need to do is to change the way in which we think. It's about the how, not about the what. And that, incidentally, is another hemispheric distinction. The left is interested in things, objects. The right is interested in the way in which something is done, because if you do the same, apparently, in the abstract, the same thing, or say the same thing, but with a different heart, a different intention, it changes it completely.
Boy, I have so many responses to that. So what percentage of this, as a neuroscientist or a psychiatrist, you mentioned people's belief or wanting assurance that everything is going to be okay. What percent of the opening of awareness or aha is that they recognize that things are not okay and that it opens them up to a different way of thinking? Said differently, the role of this podcast is to integrate the various foundational tenets of modern civilization, energy, money, environment, human behavior, ecology, all of it. And it's pretty clear there are some serious things wrong. Does a recognition and a facing of that reality bring someone closer to that aha moment? Right. Or is it the opposite, that it's, I need to know that things are going to be okay. I'm not going to listen to this story. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, of course, different people will respond in different ways. But I think that in general, realizing that there is definitely something wrong is a very good first step. And again, one comes back to the psychiatric patient. No patient goes to see a psychiatrist because everything's absolutely fine. And in fact, one of the first things one wants to do with such patients is say, well, let's look at some of the things you're doing that tend to lead to the wrong kind of outcome. So that's why my most recent book, and probably the book in which I have said most of what I can ever say, is entitled The Matter with Things. Because everybody understands that there is something that is the matter with things. And a subtext is
Dude,
has something to do with our obsession with a kind of vision of matter, material things that I don't recognize. And indeed with things rather than relationships and processes, which I believe is what the world is made of. So when we talk about things to do, we have to be careful that we're not talking about something that is a left hemisphere, I can now relax and I don't need to do any more. What we need is instead to try and shift as many people's understanding by nothing less than a moment of insight, an aha moment, so that what is required then comes naturally to them, as it does to the patient. The patient says, I don't want to keep going back to this story, but it was an eye-opener for me when I started. That I would say on the first occasion, mistakenly, I think it would be good if you did X. And they go, well, I don't know, and they'd go away and not do it. And then after, 6 months, 9 months, a year of therapy and possibly some medication, they come back and they say, I suddenly realized what I need to do. It's X. And X was exactly what I said to them when we first met. The difference was that they hadn't had that readjustment of their whole mindset. And it's that readjustment of the mindset that has to happen. The things that one does after that won't be the same things one would have done even if they looked like it before that. So it's to do with how we do things, why we do things, in what spirit we do them. And in a spirit of, I think, you know, of cooperation, of compassion, of the sense of one anotherness. Because if we don't have that sense, we're not going to survive. None of us can survive alone. We can. We need to either hang together or hang separately.
I agree with that. So let me read a book, a quote from your book. What then is attention? The best way I can put it is the manner in which our consciousness is disposed towards whatever else exists. The choice we make of how we dispose our consciousness is the ultimate creative act. It renders the world what it is. It is, therefore, a moral act. It has consequences. Love, said the French philosopher Louis Lavelle, is a pure attention to the existence of the other. That you wrote in The Matter with Things. So if our attention brings our experience of the world into being and determines what I see,
yes,
it also causes me to not see where my attention is not.
Absolutely.
So given modern technology
Wait, what
and
did he
social
just say?
media and all of the attention hijacking technology, so let me read a book, a quote from your book. What then is attention? The best way I can put it is the manner in which our consciousness is disposed towards whatever else exists. The choice we make of how we dispose our consciousness is the ultimate creative act. It renders the world what it is. It is, therefore, a moral act. It has consequences. Love, said the French philosopher Louis Lavelle, is a pure attention to the existence of the other. That he wrote in The Matter with Things. So if our attention brings our experience of the world into being and determines what I see,
yes,
it also causes me to not see where my attention is not.
absolutely.
So given modern technology and social media and all of the attention hijacking technology, does that technology actually affect our values and our ethics in addition to just being technology that guides us through the day?
Absolutely it does. So
Bruh.
our culture, both the typical nature of a capitalist culture and the now destabilizing impact of the introduction of AI, that we don't entirely understand the full range and consequences of. All of this is about acquiring power, or in the case of capitalism, money. And money is power. Money is power to make choices. Now, it is all about power. And the very, very last thing that we need now is more power. What we need is more wisdom. And if we had sufficient wisdom, then more power would be useful. But if we have more power but not the wisdom required to know how to use it, we cannot help but destroy ourselves and the world. So, I'm sorry, I may repeat myself here, but this probably takes, some repeating. I'm interested in the philosophy of a German phenomenologist called Max Scheler in the early part of the 20th century. And it doesn't matter too much going into his philosophy, except that he was very much admired by Heidegger, and I think if he'd lived, would have taken the sort of philosophy of Heidegger's into a much more interesting, emotionally and morally rich realm. Anyway, he suggested that there were tiers of values, and you can think of this as a pyramid, and I put it in both, actually, because I think it's so important, in the Masterton's Hemisphere and in the Matter of Things. And at the very lowest level is the level of power and pleasure. And again, already in the 18th century, Lessing, the German philosopher Lessing, said the utility question immediately prompts, well, utility for what? And that means you've got to have some other values. But if we never answer that question,
sucks.
so we just think utility in itself is valuable. Just having more power is good. But the question is, what are we going to use that power for? And here we come to my insistence that what we need is wisdom, not power. That the values with which we exercise that power are of primary importance.
Aha.
And what are those other values? Well, he suggested that the next level up was what he called Lebenswerte, which are values of life. And what did he mean by that? He meant things like nobleness, generosity,
Fucking shit.
Of spirit, magnanimity, bravery, and their opposites, cowardice, small-mindedness, and so on. But above those was a more important level of values.
Also, Blueberry, what's
not
up,
that
man?
they're not important, but they're less important
How you
than
doing?
beauty, goodness, and truth. And above those, which he called the geistige Werte, which means the spiritual values, or the intellectual values. In German, the word Geist happens to mean both. And then at the top, das Heilige, the holy. Now, I mean, the story we've been told is that, in a very cynical way, that these values work the other way around. That the holy was invented only so that a caste of priests should be able to wield power over people. That goodness, beauty, and truth were invented goals that aimed to help people control the populace and make sure they behaved properly. And the sort of values of self-sacrifice, of magnanimity, generosity, are the sort of things that in the game of evolution the suckers go for, and those who can exploit them for it are the winners, because in the end the only thing that matters is power, the bottom level of this pyramid. But I believe very, very strongly, with every fibre of my being, from everything I have learned in life, that it does work the way that Shayla saw it. And you know, I didn't really realize until perhaps, I mean, of all my life, I thought that the concept of the divine or the sacred or the holy was important. And I don't need to emphasize it for people who react badly to this kind of thing. You know, but all I can tell you is that I think it is of the highest kind of significance. And one of the reasons that we're in a mess is because I think we have neglected our spiritual lives. And our spiritual lives, whatever you think of is meant by that, but our belief in something that is bigger and greater and more valuable than just us being here, but takes us up into it. It's not a diminution. It's not a way of putting down humanity. In fact, it's the reductionists who put down humanity. We're just a competitive ape who's not very good at things compared with a machine. But no, the vision I'm suggesting is one in which we are honoured to be able to take part, and we can talk about, you know, what a human being is and why there's life later if we want to, because I think they're quite important. But your question was, so does the way our society works, does this stop us from seeing certain things? I think was the key thing that you said.
Damn.
And I think it absolutely does, because it obviously, if attention changes the nature of what it is you attend to, so you see something different, then very obviously it can also block your vision of something, and you may not even see it at all if you don't attend to it. So if I may just give in to the pressure from people to say one thing that they'd like to do, I can tell them one thing which would be a very good start, which would be ask themselves, what is it that the way I habitually think about myself and the world is stopping me from seeing? What is it that our culture now is stopping us from seeing? And one way to think is, what did other people in other times and places, by no means stupid people, quite probably at least as intelligent as ourselves, what were they seeing? And why do we no longer see it?
Oh boy, I have so many questions now. The Rescorla Wagner learning function is kicking on in my brain, because a lot of this now starts to dovetail with my work, and importantly, my work since we talked 18 months ago. So first of all, I'll point out that your German psychologist, it was power that caused that pyramid to invert. I mean, it was
Yes.
human social power somewhere that inverted that pyramid.
Sorry, I think I'd just say Shayla was a philosopher, really, not a psychologist, but he was psychologically astute, yeah.
So, in the intervening 18 months since we've spoken last,
I'm
I've
dead.
converged on a
I
story
was not
that the
dead, all right.
stakes of our time are no less than power versus life. That's what's at stake.
Absolutely.
And power has was limited by we didn't have surplus back pre-agricultural revolution. Everyone ate about the same. There was different status, but we didn't carry stuff around. There wasn't storable, lootable stacks of grain or gold or anything like that. Then we found agricultural surplus, then fossil carbon, then money, printable, and now created by digital pen strokes. And now AI is turbocharging the whole thing. And so, in a world where power has the ability to make decisions and move atoms and bits around the world, there are small groups of humans that are going all in to get more power, the best AI and everything else. And that's pulling the rest of society and the biosphere towards a cliff. So here's some questions on that. In a group of humans, if there is some surplus and there is a small percentage of people, of the humans, you could say 10 out of 100 or even 1 out of 100, does the preponderance of left hemisphere dominated thinking and behavior, is it kind of this inevitable positive feedback loop that happens that pulls the rest of that group of humans along with it? Does that make sense? Because it feels like that's what's happening, because lots of people aren't dominated by power. They're just part of the downward causation of the economic superorganism going through their motions, following the cultural zeitgeist. What do you think about that, the insidiousness in the presence of all this economic surplus, that left hemisphere thinking becomes a virus almost?
Well, I'm getting behind again.
I see why you say that. I'm not sure it's exactly what I would say. I think the problem, and I'm thinking back here to other societies, other civilizations before our own, that have, if you like, fallen off the same cliff. And the common factors were, yes, material overreach or territorial overreach or both, and a sort of decontextualization of each human life from the necessary togetherness of manageably sized social groups. So as a civilization got bigger and bigger, people got further and further removed from those over whom they had control, and thought in more theoretical and therefore typically left hemisphere terms about what the solutions to things should be, things started to go wrong. And you can trace in the art of these civilizations, I'm thinking here primarily of the ones that I know best, which are the Greek and the Roman, you can see everything signaling left hemisphere takeover here. And I'm not sure that it's sort of contagion from one person to the next exactly, although I can't rule out that obviously plays a part. But I think it's to do with the overall vision of a society, of its leaders, of what it is that they're doing. And that has this impact on us. And what we desperately need is to be able to secure a number of like-minded people who see the world differently and have a vision which speaks to people in such a way that they go, my God, yes, I see what it is I've been missing. So I really think the first question that anyone should ask is, what is it that's missing from my life? What is it that I know other people have had, and in other times and places, cultures have had, but we don't seem to have this. That is the clue
You worthless cockroaches.
So, yeah, I mean, we could take that anywhere.
How did I just do that?
Here's where I'd like to take it. I just had a profound thought, which as a teacher and a psychiatrist, you might smack down immediately. So we are a product of evolutionary forces. There's something called multi-level selection. E.O. Wilson, David Sloat Wilson talked about cooperation and competition, both being hardwired in us, depending on our ancestral conditions, that selfish individuals outcompeted cooperative individuals within a group, but cooperative groups outcompeted selfish groups, and therefore we are all descended from both of those. You might also argue that the left brain and the right brain offered similar multi-level selection situations in our evolutionary past.
Damn.
What about if power and life at a cultural level is now the next signpost and threshold, but we've never lived on a full planet where we're impacting the biosphere, and now the evolutionary selection is really between power and life continuing in any reasonable form the way that it has evolved since the last mass extinction. And so I wonder if there's a multi-level selection occurring this century applied to our species, and maybe, you know, within individually within. And, you know, sub question to that, is there any way that those people who are right hemisphere balanced could become leaders? Because it seems like the left hemisphere categorization and goal seeking and power accumulation by definition gets selected as leaders. What are your thoughts on all that?
Ooh.
That's a big bite.
Yes. Well, the first thing to say is that, and I think this is in what you were saying, is that species that have thrived and prospered have been those that have learnt to cooperate. They have been able to compete, and I think competition at a certain level, in a certain degree, is healthy. I don't think it's a negative. But on the other hand, it must be with cooperation, and the two together make us able to thrive. And so when and these are very distinctly related to the left and right hemisphere. So the left hemisphere is generally thinking in terms of me, and the right hemisphere is thinking not that I don't matter, but in a less egoistic way, that what I am is determined by
The motherfucker.
where I've come from nature, from society, that I am made what I am by the people I know, that I owe to them, and that we are together in this. And, you know, that's an enormously lovely and comforting thought. And it's perfectly realistic. In a high-functioning society, there is competition, but there is also enormous creativity, because people are coming together to do things.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I forgive me, because throughout this conversation, I periodically forget that the camera is rolling and we're doing a podcast. I feel like I'm in office hours with my professor, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what about that? So let me ask you this. So in my work, I propose kind of three separate timelines that humanity faces. And one is right now, where we're trying to kick the can with various biophysical, macroeconomic can-kicking methods like debt and maybe some new technology that rearranges the deck chairs in a slightly different way. And then we have what I call the bend versus break moment, when the financial house of cards is a Wile E. Coyote sort of moment. I think that's in the next 10 years or so. And then we've got the resolution, or the post-peak carbon pulse, more sustainable, when the financial overshoot is kind of gone, and we're, you know, the great simplification. So with respect to your work, while you were just speaking, it made me think that your work is not incredibly relevant to right now, because there are no solutions to what's coming. It's kind of inevitable to what's coming. But it's very relevant to informing and educating and inspiring society and a greater number of human beings to ask, what's missing? What's the matter with things? So that during this bend not break moment, we're asking better questions, we've changed our values. And then even more importantly than that is whatever culture comes afterwards, the mitochondria of some new civilization or new human culture is informed by this holistic reminding us of our past and awe and sacredness and kind of a spiritual sense, which even if people are unaware of your work, I think a lot of just the common
the fuck's happening? Okay.
Person knows that something is wrong and something is missing and they don't quite understand it. So what is your opinion on these three timelines and the importance of left brain, right brain integration and balance during those timelines?
It reminds me of something that I have said when people have asked me, so, really we do need to know, we need to have some guidance about what to do.
Yeah.
And this also reflects the three timelines that you have mentioned in a way. But the first thing to say is that I don't agree that what I'm saying is not relevant now. I think it's highly and most relevant now, because if we don't start changing the way in which we think, there won't be that future. Your timelines won't be there, or they will be there, but we won't. So we have to be preparing the future. And the thing is, we are so mesmerized in our left hemisphere way by the immediate that we don't think broadly and deeply and over a long enough time span about what we're doing. Because we are making the future. And so we are responsible for the world that more than others will come to have if we're lucky. So I think it's terribly important, but I think there are three ways, if I may reflect back to you, it's not exactly your three timelines, but I think there's something very germane here and close to what you're saying. I think there are three ways in which people can respond to this, and I'm going to take them in the order of increasing importance, but they will sound to be in the order of decreasing importance. So, and that's because of the way we think. So they're all important, every single one of them. And let's start with the one that most people will think of, which is, grand corporate intergovernmental initiatives and joining those and being part of them, because after all, if this is a global problem, it must be tackled globally. And there's truth in that, but there's also, as always is, a hidden other side to it. And in fact, I mean, it's no secret that a lot of what has been done by these organizations has done very little to move forward the real inspiring goals that they were designed to achieve, but has instead, either intentionally or unintentionally, resulted in the extreme enrichment of certain groups involved in these power-wielding organizations. So that's the one that everybody thinks is important, and in some ways it might be, but I'm not convinced at the moment it is. The next is I liked your image of the mitochondria. I think of it as like seeding little colonies in a nutrient medium that are going to spread. And here I'm thinking of the practice of initiating the practice now, not waiting until it's too late, of ways of thinking about education, ways of thinking about social engagement with one another, and fulfilling our needs in terms of agriculture and so on, that are small foci that in the future, when the crunch comes, when the breaking point happens, they will be our chance both to survive and to seed something for the future that will be less monumentally hubristic and destructive than the way we now think. So, I mean, here I think he was called Abraham Heschel, wasn't he? The rabbi that I think I quote him 2 or 3 times in my work. And he said a lot of very wise things, but one of them is, in the past, our civilization might have perished for want of power, but now it perishes for want of wonder. And he was really saying that getting a little humility and a sense of how wondrous life is, because without it, life isn't worth living. I mean, you might as well stop. Without those things, we are doomed. So these things that sound, in a way, kind of airy-fairy and not gritty, because they're not what sort of bankers and politicians talk about, are actually the real deal. They are the real things that are important. I loved your notion of power against life, because I do believe that we are not living life fully. I think we're living now in a simulacrum of life. We're not actually living life. And I found this extraordinary quotation in the 19th century from a novelist, Swiss, I think, novelist called Kuhnberger, who said, "Life no longer lives." I thought it was extraordinary. It really kind of went like in my heart, and I've never removed the dagger. And I think he's so right. Anyway, to come to the third point, the third sounds initially, how's that going to help? But it is actually, in my view, the thing that must happen, the only one of the 3 that must happen. And luckily, it is something that doesn't require a great deal of power or a great deal of money or a great deal of time. It just requires a desire for the world, for life, for nature to thrive, and for our lives to be different from the ones that we have now. And that is to begin, if I may put it this way, in the space within the inner temple. Now, that can start not even tomorrow. That can start today. Because what I'm saying is we need to begin a process of examination of what our values truly are, of what we are leaving behind, what we are doing to help here. And people think in this very spatial, typically left hemisphere way about how small they are and how big the world is and how much bigger the cosmos is, and the world is just a small thing in it. That doesn't matter at all, because what's going on this earth is extremely important. It can't be more important, actually. I think there are enormous things that are at stake here to do with the values of life and spiritual life. And we don't know how big the changes we make can be said to be. I sometimes say, if you truly experience love, and in some ways, of course, love is not just erotic love, but it's also the basis of the moral and spiritual life in almost every tradition. If you do experience love, how big is that love? And actually, what you experience is the only thing you will ever experience. The only thing that you will ever experience is what goes on inside you. I mean, I don't mean that the whole world is made up by us, and that's a whole other story, and I definitely argue against that right from the start. But nonetheless, your experience is only your experience. It is of other things, but your experience is your experience. And how you experience it makes the world and your life and everything you find in it what it is. So there cannot be anything more important for you. Now, you might say, well, yeah, but isn't that being selfish? Because it's just about me. Shouldn't I be bothering myself on behalf of other people? And yes, there are ways, of course, of doing that in a more explicit way. But we don't know what the outcome of thinking and talking in a new way can be. Margaret Mead, I think, the great anthropologist, said that it's not just that some movements begin from a small seed. Every movement, however big, begins from a small seed. It has to. That's how movements begin. Just as an oak grows from an acorn. We need to be part. Don't be discouraged by the idea that you're too small or what you can do is not important. What you can do is extremely important if it is, if you like, centered in, directed towards the purpose of enlarging what is good, beautiful, and true in the world.
Let me summarize some of the points you made in our first conversation and apply them to what you just said and to my own work. Let me unpack this a little bit. So I think you've watched some of my Friday musings. They're called Franklies. And I have a therapist, a cranial sacral therapist I know nothing about. But after she works with me, I have much greater balance between my sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and I just feel more grounded. And she said that she watched some of my Franklies, like a smattering of them, and that she loved the content. The concepts were very interesting and relevant. She could tell that I was kind and positive. But on some of them, she could tell that my nervous system, my fight or flight, was activated, and that I was predominantly in my sympathetic nervous system, and that could be transmitted on camera to others. So a lot of the things that she's helping me with are things that you recommended in our first podcast, which is to slow down, to listen in the quiet, and also to not worry about being productive all the time, but to have fallow periods.
Yes.
And that sometimes the greatest bursts of productivity came after a period of not doing much at all. So you also said in our first conversation that you are a student of and an adherent of Eastern philosophies like Buddhism and Zen. So here's my question. At a time when things are chaotic in the world and about to become more chaotic, if there are people who slow down, become more fallow in order to be healthier and eventually more productive, to be more quiet, to moving towards the right hemisphere, is that enough to combat the left brain power hungry dominance of the economic superorganism? In other words, is ascribing to being Zen in these times relegating to becoming a witness of what's happening, or can it, one human change to 10, to 100, to 1,000, to 1,000,000, actually change the initial conditions of the future? What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, first of all, I think that last thing is true, but I'd also say that I don't think that having a Zen cast of mind means that you never do anything.
Help me understand that.
I think one of the things is that to be always productive is very unproductive. To be to be always busy is a kind of laziness. To act too quickly and too much is to lose the prize. And it's often won by a simple single stroke, which needs to find its moment. So I think that Zen is not a way of abdicating responsibility for the world. I don't know if you know at all the work of a man called Rod Dreher. No, he has a blog which I think is very interesting. But he wrote a book called The Benedict Option, and he's just published a book called Living in Wonder. And in fact, I've been asked to interview him at the Oxford Literary Festival in a few months' time. And the reason I mention it is that in his book, The Benedict Option, he was misunderstood to mean that actually what we need to do is run away and form little groups in the hills. And I'm not saying that either when I talk about these small nuclei, these mitochondria, as you put it, that it's a running away. It's a tough option, but it is and it's an engaged option, but it is one that is sufficiently removed from the pressures of quite unnecessary forces that buffet us in everyday modern urban Western life. It's removed enough for something good to come out of that. And I often think that if there weren't, I mean, if it came to this, if there weren't monastic communities, I very much respect them. And you may know that in my younger life, I anticipated I might become a member of such a community. I haven't, and I'm sure it was right that I didn't. But I think that if there weren't such places, I would feel that the world was an immeasurably poorer place, and there would be nowhere, as it were, where any kind of spiritual stabilizing was housed.
I guess that's at the root of my question, is these nucleotides or mitochondria or small groups of humans living generally the directional way that you're describing, slower, quieter.
It is all of that, the slower and quieter and all those things, and I didn't want to repeat all the things I said last time, which probably were much more practical than what I'm saying now. But I think that I'm not saying that these, I always come down to this figure 3%. I'm not sure who it was who said it, that if you can change the way of seeing the world of 3% of people, you have the basis of a movement that will, really carry the day.
I think it was Malcolm Gladwell, but I'm not sure.
Oh, right, maybe. Oh, okay, yes, I think it was before. It might be wrong. But in any case, it's not that people would be simply keeping themselves to themselves. I'm saying that when we have a point of view that we think is important, we act on it, and we all have different strengths. We speak about it, we do it, we try and promulgate it in whatever way we best can. But also, I think it's not just utilitarian in that way, that it actually does change the way people think. So we don't know quite how contagious a way of thinking can be, and we don't know quite how that contagion spreads. But again, to talk of somebody that whether you are an adherent of Christianity or not, that you have to, I think, admire Jesus Christ. He was a poor man who was effectively treated as a criminal and died the death of a slave. And yet, and he didn't have social media, and he didn't give public lectures, but somehow whatever it was that he was saying was so important that people were prepared to sacrifice their lives to see that it was transmitted. So there is something that happens when ideas that are very, very important have their moment and people see them and feel their mind changed. And that is the key thing. It's this, I don't want to get away from the idea of an aha moment, because I think without the aha moment, it's too easy to carry on with business as usual, thinking, oh, I've now, in a very left hemisphere way, I've now got all the right hemisphere principles and I'm doing fine. I think there actually has to be a bump in the journey, really, and that sometimes, as in faith, I think losing faith for a while is a very important stage post on a deepening of faith. And I think that understanding certain ideas, you go through phases where at times, you espouse certain things, you then let go of them, and then only later you can see what was important in them or what was not important in them. So we're changing all the time, and that's good. So in terms of knowledge, I mean, again, to be a bit zen about this, there is a big distinction between ignorance and not knowing. So if you ask me what's the answer to this question, I mean, I might be entirely ignorant. You might ask me what's the coefficient of expansion of brass. I don't know the answer off the top of my head. But you might ask me, what is the meaning of life? And my not knowing, I think, is somewhat wiser than my coming up with a simple formulation. So there's a kind of ignorance that is this side of knowing, and a kind of unknowing that is that side of knowing. And it's where a lot of very important teachers and thinkers have ended up. I mean, among them Montaigne, que sais-je, you know? And it is also, again, a common saying of those who have followed the spiritual path.
So let's go to some of the questions that
Cool.
caused me to rip up my outline of questions.
All right, looks like a good place to stop. He's starting a new line of questions. So that's really cool. I'm loving this episode so far. It's really good. That puts us right at an hour too. Very nice timing. So we're gonna go ahead and bounce. Thanks for checking it out, and y'all